Welcome everyone to our follow-up video from the Tuesday COVID-19 webinar. Suba and I thought we would take a couple of minutes to answer some of the questions that we received yesterday but didn't have a chance to answer live. So I'm going to ask Suba the first question right now. He's going to ask me one and he'll do one more. So the first question for Suba is, are essential employees who travel to a restricted state required to get tested for the virus when they return to New York?
So the Q&A does have several protocols for employees essential workers who travel to one of the restricted states and then come back to New York. And one of those protocols is that the employee should get tested as soon as possible within 24 hours. It doesn't appear to necessarily be a requirement on the part of the employer to make sure that the employee get tested, but if the employer is aware that the essential worker has traveled to a restricted state and come back, it is probably a good practice for the employer to make sure that the employee gets tested and submits some documentation that the employee has been tested. So Teresa, one of the questions we got several times is if an employee has family visiting from one of the restricted states and actually staying at the employee's house, is the employee then required to quarantine, either while the relative is staying in their house or after the relative leaves?
So the executive orders and the Department of Health guidance do not address an employee quarantining simply because they have a visitor from one of the restricted states. Rather, if you look at the Department of Health guidance that came out on June 24th, you'll see that they have specific requirements for any individual who comes in from a restricted state. And those requirements are meant to isolate those individuals from anyone in New York, including people that they're there to visit or even living with. So please follow those requirements if you have a visitor coming in from one of the restricted states. And then Suba, one last question for you. What about travel restrictions for certain cities? We've heard a lot about travel restrictions for states, but for cities who meet the infection level requirement, are there travel restrictions for those as well?
There are not as of right now, July 8th, 2020. The only executive order that we have at this point is applicable to certain states that meet certain metrics. So there may very well be a city within one of those states within a state that's not on the list that meets those metrics. But if the state is not on the list, the employee will not have to quarantine just because the employee's been in a city that meets those metrics. Thank you very much. Hope to talk to you again soon.